And first, a little bit about the background of my presentation. Where does it come from? And it's based on my own work in this area for the past, say, 2 decades or so. And my PhD was in innovation studies, so that's the basic approach that I'm taking. But we see innovation as inherently a socio-technical process, whereas many still tend to see it as a technical process. And in terms of the work I've done, it's based on a variety of Horizon 2020 projects, on scaling of innovation, on the wider adoption of innovations, you might say. For instance, there was one project on the role of advice and advisors that play an extremely important role in the scaling of innovations, but also on the role of demonstration, also expressed as peer-to-peer learning, where farmers learn from farmers. And that's also a very important channel to make innovations wider known. Second class of projects were the so-called RIO projects. I'll get to that in the rest of my talk. RIO is a Dutch acronym which stands for Reflective Interactive Design, and where we designed new animal husbandry studies for all kinds of animals. And this is very much transdisciplinary work with stakeholders. Also, one thing, and that's what we've moved to over the past 5 years more and more, is to do scenario studies and develop visions of future sustainable systems. But also, not just to make these visions, but also to explore how can we get there. And this is what we call transition pathways. And another very important thing over the past couple of years is that at Wageningen University and Research, we have what we call a farm of the future, where we do agronomic research. And one of the things we investigate is possibilities for strip cropping and to let ecology play a larger role in creating resilient agrarian systems. But it's not just agronomic research, it's also a meeting space for events with farmers and stakeholders. And the interesting thing is that various provinces in the Netherlands have now become interested and want to have their own farm of the future. Because it's very much now in the province of Flevoland, which is a very clayey soil. But future farming is very different in clayey environments than in sandy environments. So other regions with other soils want to have something for themselves in that term. So it's a nice sort of example, I think, for other regions. Okay, starting with innovation. I think it is important to make a distinction between two general patterns in innovation. The first, and which is the most common one and best known one, is substitution, which is often of a technical kind, which means that you have a system and you try to improve some aspects in small steps, which leads to an overall pattern of incremental change. So, for instance, reducing pesticide in agriculture or lowering NOx emissions, etc. But the overall system remains more or less intact, you might say. So this is the dominant pattern, and it will solve certain sustainability problems. But we also have what we call wicked problems, like global warming or reducing biodiversity. And it seems that our system has some fundamental flaws to address these. So this is where the idea of more radical change came from. That is indicated with several words. Transformation is one of them. The one I commonly use is transition, but you may also read transformation if you're more familiar with that. So that's a more radical form of change. It's also called system innovation. So the system itself is completely overhauled, you might say. And some examples in farming might be ecology-based farming or circular agriculture. But such transformations are extremely difficult to realize because you have all kinds of resistance in the current system because of all kinds of dependencies you have in these systems. So you can't just take one thing out. It immediately, some actor will resist and you have a problem in changing things. Yet, it does seem needed to address a variety of sustainability challenges that we have. So how do we do that? A little bit more about these transitions. Some important characteristics of transitions is that it's not just about changing the production side, not just about changing agriculture, but also the consumption side. how do we use foods, and how does that work, and what preferences do we have, etc. But because so much changes in the transitions, they tend to take a long time, of the order of decades in many cases. And because they're so complex, you cannot simply organize a transition, not from the drawing board and just say, oh, we implement it and then we start the change process or so. What you can do is to stimulate them in what I call a learning by doing approach, which means that you have some idea where we want to go. Okay, let's work on that for a couple of years, but then try to learn what we have done and how it works, and monitor things and reflect, and etc. That's what I call a learning by doing approach. I think important about transition is to distinguish between two main phases. And this is, you might say, purely analytical, because in practice they run in parallel, you might say. But analytically, it makes sense to make the distinction between one, you have a phase in which you have experimenting and learning on novelties. I use the word novelties rather than innovations, just to stress the point that, or to make people think a bit wider than just technologies. And the concept that I've used in some of my publications for that is anchoring. How do you anchor an innovation in the societal setting, in a specific societal setting? And once these pioneer farmers have demonstrated that an innovation can work in their practice, then you can think about wider uptake by mainstream farmers. And we've used the concept of scaling for that, but you may forget these concepts because they are not key for this presentation now. But what I do want to stress is that this distinction needs to be reflected in research and policy. And often in policy, especially, I see that people are not well aware, because when they see an innovation, they immediately ask the question, hey, how can we scale this up? And this is much too soon. You first have to demonstrate it and learn about it by pioneer farmers. About the first step then, the first phase, about learning on novelties. So you do this with pioneer farmers, and pioneer farmers are farmers which, in contrast to mainstream farmers that often see problems when they see something new, pioneer farmers sees challenges and possibilities, etc. So there may be 3 to 5% of the farmers that have that sort of attitude. And with them, you try to make the novelties work in practice. And it's just not just about a couple of novelties, but there's an enormous range of novelties that you need to investigate, because you do not know upfront which of these novelties will eventually actually be possible, or make it possible to change the system as a whole. But very importantly is that it's not just individual farmers that should work on it. You should have exchange between these farmers on how things work, also to fuel their thinking with new experiences and also with new ideas about doing new things, etc. And communities of practice is one way that you might organize that. About the sources of the novelties, where did they come from? One is in practice. I mean, the farming community, I think the farming sector is by far the most innovative sector that we have in our economies, because we have so many people working on things, encountering problems day to day and try to do things differently also. Second important source of novelties, of course, is research, in both in industry and in various agrarian institutes. And the third, and I want to tell you a little bit more about these, is to start from scratch, to start redesign something completely new. And what we have done at Wageningen over the past 2 decades is do this in a co-design process with researchers and practitioners. And this is where the RIO comes in, the reflective interactive design. In the early 2000s, we did the first RIO project by developing a new hen house for laying hens. And this eventually was called the Roundel. The way we did that is that we had a design group with farmers and researchers. And the first thing we did is to analyze the functions that were needed in a hen house. And with functions, we mean things like feeding, or things like manure removal or collecting eggs, etc. Not about the technical ways how to implement it. Now, what do you want to achieve? The second step was to analyze the externalities. What kind of things come out of the hen house that are not for the eggs, but that have a burden on the wider environment, like the environmental stuff, or animal welfare was a very big issue in the Netherlands then, etc. On the basis of these two, we developed what we called a brief of requirements. What new requirements should a new hen house system fulfill to serve these functions, but to minimize externalities? And then on the basis of this brief of requirements, we started a creative process with the participants, so both the farmers and the researchers, and to try and identify new ways to fulfill these functions, but with less problematic externalities. And then as a final step, you had all kinds of partial things then, partial elements. We made these building blocks into a full new design. So that lasted, I think, in total a year and a half or so with a number of sessions. And then we worked on dissemination. We made a very nice brochure, we did a website, and we had a roadshow. We went all through the Netherlands, talked to farmers, farmers organizations, etc., and tell them about the great things that we had done, and not just us, stressing that this was a farmer's design. So farmers had thought about how to make it work in practice. Did it lead to wider uptake? It appeared immediately that there were enormous barriers. Some of the main ones came from the value chain. It appeared that this hen house was somewhat more expensive than the regular hen house. As a result, the eggs had to be 1 cent more expensive. But then the egg company said, yeah, but that means that we have to keep your eggs from this 1 or 2 or 3 hen house. So we have to keep them separate from all the other eggs. That's far too complex for us. And the supermarket said, yeah, we had to have a separate shelf for these eggs, etc. And we have so many shelves already with different products, etc. So they were also very resistant. And one of the surprising ones came from the regulatory side. In the municipality of Barneveld, which is the hen capital of the Netherlands, you might say, they have all kinds of building permits. And one of the permits prescribed that a hen house should have a box shape with a roof. And what we had was a sort of pentagon. It was a very different shape, so it didn't fulfill the building codes. It took a year and a half or 2 years almost to get the building permit for that. So all in all, it took 10 years for the first hen house to be realized from when we started in the 2000s. And we thought we have to do things a little bit different. So when we started working on other animal categories from more or less 2010 or so, one thing we did is that we involved a wider group of stakeholders, not just farmers, but also supermarkets and egg companies in the case of the eggs, but also regulatory stakeholders. And furthermore, we did not just rely on the group that was involved in the design process itself, but we organized a wider discussion group around this to try and make them also the co-owners of the process and of the outcomes. So the anchoring, the term I used before, we organized as a parallel process. And the wider uptake of these, what we indeed did realize is that a larger group of participants felt that this was their thing and they wanted to realize it. And as a result, various systems were indeed realized, but it kept just to a small scale. And what it appeared is that the products from these kind of husbandry systems were more expensive and they were only for niche markets. So the average customer did not buy these somewhat more expensive, well, we were talking about the order of 5 to 10% or so, somewhat more expensive products, but they did not reach the average customer. So in conclusion, we thought, if there is no compensation for the farmer for the extra cost made, then it will not work. And the compensation should either be in the product price, or what you also could think about is to give rewards for ecosystem services that a farmer provides. Just a hen house with fewer emissions, because it's something that you can put a value on. This started us to think further about the conditions for the uptake of innovations. And there are two main paths to stimulate uptake. One is via economics and via pricing, and the second is via regulation. If we look at the economics side, then we have to acknowledge that global food markets are extremely competitive, and they are global indeed to a large extent. What we also need to acknowledge is that there's a very large array of external costs to food systems, environment, for instance, or energy in connection with transporting food products all over the world, and also in connection with health. Our diets are not very healthy, but these external costs hardly influence the dynamic of the system. So it is it's extremely difficult for innovation with a better sustainability performance to break through in such a system just on economic grounds. So I think here is an enormous research challenge. Can we explore options for true pricing in which the external costs are in one way or another included in the cost of our food so that the right price signals are given at least? So this is something I think that should be addressed more in research. I've seen fairly little of it so far, I must say. And the second path to stimulate uptake is regulation, and they are in the process of change, you might say, that over the past 50 years, what we have seen is that regulators emphasize to facilitate food production and trade. And as a result, we now have a system that is very well tuned, you might say, and extremely difficult to change. You see that the regulation ambition has very much changed over the past year. Look at the European programs, for instance, with farm to fork, etc. But it is extremely difficult to change the systems that we have produced on the basis of 50 years of stimulation. But even if we now try to stimulate more sustainable ways to organize our system, what should we stimulate and how can we choose? What we do see is that we have a variety of sustainability problems related to agriculture. We also see that there is an enormous array of innovations already around that have been developed and demonstrated. But all these innovations are not all just good news. They also have misfits with the current system. So misfits in terms of cost, in terms of they do not fit the current farming practice, or as I explained with the laying hen hacks, the value chain has problems. And what we then try to do is that we try to squeeze these innovations into a system that has fundamental flaws. So the big issue, I think, is not to make the system that we have better, but to make a better system. How do we get there? And how can we identify what would be a better system? That is a challenge in itself. And this is where the notion of transition pathways comes in. I had a bit of an itching nose. How do we identify? First step is to identify the building blocks for a future system. And one way to start, at least, is to look at all the innovations, the promises that are already around. So both the technical and the non-technical innovation, from both practice and from research. And all of these innovations we should assess in terms of strengths and weaknesses on the basis of a number of criteria. For instance, their food production, how well do they produce food? Sustainability criteria, and we have to think broadly about sustainability. So it could be climate change, it could be environmental burden, animal welfare, and what have you. But also, of course, the economics. Can we make it work financially? But, and I think I've seen very little of that. We should not just look at individual innovations, because when we look at individual innovations, we start immediately thinking about how can we fit it in the current system. Now, abstain from that and look at combinations of innovations, smart combinations. For instance, if you look at smart and digital technologies, there's a lot of work in agriculture on that. but it's implemented in the current systems into our big and heavy machinery, etc. But if you combine smart equipment with light equipment, you open up a very different avenue, namely an avenue in which you have lighter equipment on the land, which helps to address soil compaction. But because it is smart, you can also make it work longer. For if it can work on its own. So the overall vision you might have is that you have smart and light equipment on the land working 24/7, for instance. So you combine a number of innovations that are currently being worked on separately. Then when you have the building blocks of this future system, then you can start building a future system. And very importantly, what I already mentioned in the introduction, that we should do that with stakeholders and use these promises and smart combination to create a system that satisfies food production and sustainability criteria. How to realize such a future vision? And this is, of course, the million or billion euro question. I don't have say an overall and validated answer, but we do have a pathway that we are trying to explore in the work that we do at work. First, a couple of preface remarks, you might say. The visions of the future system will be radically different. So when you present them, and we had that with the hen house, for instance, when we did the roadshow, that many would say it's not realistic because it's so different. You can never make it work. Well, the trick we use there is that we, with a new vision, we create a giant leap from here into 20 or 30 years ahead. But rather than just seeing this giant gap between the present and the future, we try to break it into a series of smaller, plausible steps. And this series of smaller, plausible steps, we call a transition pathway. And then if the people who work on this say, oh, this is a small step, but it is plausible, and if each of the 10, 20, or 30 steps is plausible in itself, then the final outcome is also plausible. And for that reason, it is very important to involve the stakeholders in this process, because this helps them to raise a warning, hey, this radical change may occur as the result of a series of very small steps. So, and if you have such a transition pathway in terms of a series of small steps, then you can start thinking about strategic action for various actors to try and make the first step, and then the second step, and then the third step, etc. And in such a process, I think there's also an important role for researchers, because the researchers can monitor the progress on these steps after a certain period of time. But also, what I already mentioned before, to organize occasional exchange for joint learning between the various stakeholders. And also, at a certain point, say after 3 or 5 years, to have a sort of reflection. What did we do in the past 3 or 5 years? Did we keep on track? If not, is that something bad? Or should we maybe rethink our vision a little bit, etc. So this is the process that we are trying to organize now with stakeholders, and how we are trying to contribute to the overall change process towards a transition. Let me end with 2 slides on some final reflections on the presentation that I just made. First, I think in innovation, the main challenges for sustainable agriculture are not technical, but they are social. Although technology, of course, can help us. Smart and light equipment, of course, will certainly help, and that needs stimulations. But I do stress that we're already, with proven technology and farmer practices, we can easily achieve a sustainable agriculture, at least on paper. Why is it so problematic? Because the main barriers are economic and political, including the political will to change the economic playing field, because that is something what I stressed is needed, that the economic playing field should change via forms of true pricing. But also a very important barrier has to do with the food preferences that we have, for instance. For instance, our habit of consuming a lot of meat, an example. Yet we have these economic barriers, but we have to realize that these economic barriers are an artifact of how the economic political system attributes cost, and in which all kinds of external costs are not in the food pricing. With true pricing, and that's the immediate objection that we also now hear in the Netherlands, is that the consumer prices go up. But the consumer also has enormous gains, but they do not feel it because they pay for them via the taxes. All kinds of externalities are now addressed by all kinds of government measures, etc. They also pay for that, but they just don't see it. And then finally, this also translates into a number of research challenges of a number of sorts. One is about desk research challenges, and the other about transdisciplinary projects. Concerning desk research, what I very much stress is to explore options for true pricing of funds. So I would very much welcome if researchers would develop various scenarios about how that might be implemented, so that we can start thinking about how we might get there. A second important challenge is to make overviews of all kinds of portfolio of promises for various agrarian sectors. So the promises for animal husbandry, of course, are very much different for greenhouse horticulture or for arable farming. But also very importantly, not just look at individual promises, but also to look at smart combinations of promises. The second main cluster of items to work on is transdisciplinary project with stakeholders. One, to develop future visions with sustainability systems, but then also take a second step and explore the transition pathways to get there. And what we saw on the basis of these Rio approaches is that there are all kinds of project participants, farmers, who do want to start something. They can do with a lot of support also from researchers to learn about their new things, and also to exchange learning with their fellow farmers working on these new things. And a very important one that now may come a little bit out of the blue, but is very much based on the current big discussions that we have in the Netherlands, is that research needs to better inform policy to counterbalance simple truths. One of the simple truths in the Netherlands is that farmers say, hey, farming is extremely important for our food production, so there is no farmer that you that say to cancel a number of farms, etc., would be bad for our food production. What they don't tell is 2/3 of farming production is for export. So in practice, in principle, we could do with 1/3 of our farmers. But the simple truth is, this is bad for farming and this is bad for our food system. So, and this finally, this translates into a number of political challenges to implement true pricing. And this final point that I just made on the validated research findings rather than simple truths. What I do see a lot of politicians that they find the simple truths easier to digest than the validated research findings. So I think there's a lot of work to be done for researchers in that respect. That's it. Thank you very much.